It was a crossing the Rubicon moment. Keeney must have understood it would be incredibly difficult to turn back now. On August 25th, the miners began their march. For 20 miles, men from every corner of the globe marched alongside one another. They marched for the 30 miners still stuck in jail. They marched for basic union representation. They marched for each other. John Brown's body resounded in the hills of West Virginia once more. Now it was sung by Unionist miners instead of Union soldiers. And now, instead of the classic chorus, the words were changed to, "We'll hang Don Chaffin to a sour apple tree." An automobile drove alongside the Overall Brigade, consisting of some of the wives, sisters, and daughters of the miners who had nursing experience. Everyone knew full well they were marching toward battle and possible death. These miners were not afraid, however. They faced death every single day underground, and a majority of them had fought in the trenches against the German Hun. Some had fought against Filipino natives, others against the Spanish regular army up the slopes of San Juan Hill and amongst the mangroves in Puerto Rico. Many wore their uniforms and some still had their gas masks, but all wore the red bandana. These rednecks were led by Bill Blizzard, a young, brash, and bold union organizer. Beyond this, they were divided into, quote, squads, platoons, companies, and battalions, unquote, which were led by union subdivision leaders. This was the largest civil insurrection in American history, sans the Civil War. However, it is not mentioned in the Harper's Encyclopedia of Military History, while much smaller insurrections in different countries are covered extensively. I think it's important to note this event. Chaffin was ready for the rabble. He had been stockpiling weapons and ammunitions for such an eventuality. James Green says this cache included, quote, 10 machine guns, 1,000 rifles, and 67,000 rounds of ammunition, unquote. He ordered the 4,000 men under his command to take up defensive positions on the ridges surrounding Logan. He also ordered 3 biplanes for reconnaissance and air attack. Chaffin said he would use, quote, every engine of modern warfare, unquote. The stage was set for a grand battle. For the veterans on both sides, the hills and forests reminded them of French battlefields. The trenches, parapets, and machine gun nests dug for defensive purposes only added to the feeling. August 26th was the final chance for cooler heads to prevail, and President Harding was hoping to resolve the issue before it was too late. General Harry H. Bandholtz arrived in West Virginia in lieu of federal infantry, as many critics argued the use of infantry in state and local law enforcement disputes was a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. Bandholtz was a 4-star general who served with distinction in the Great War, and he was not one for mincing words. When asked how he would counter the miners' offensive, he replied, quote, gas. We dropped tear gas all over the place. If they refused to disperse, then we'd open up, with artillery and everything, unquote. He met with UMWA leaders Keeney and Mooney. He said this was their last chance, and if they did not disperse their people, he would snuff out the rebellion, quote, like that. And he snapped his fingers under the men's noses. He closed by saying, quote, this will never do. There are several million unemployed in this country. This thing might assume proportions that would be hard to handle, unquote. Keeney truly started to understand the powers arrayed against him, and he seemed to have folded his all in hand. He called on the miners to turn back. The miners nearly denounced Keeney, but he forced acquiescence to his way with a voice vote. When Chaffin heard this, he began standing down his men. Lewis White, a unionist not present at the voice vote, pedaled up to the assembled miners. White was described by friends as, quote, mean as a snake, unquote. He had no time for these two union leaders trying to prevent the coming struggle. He shouted, quote, "Oh, hell, what you two need is a bullet between each of your eyes," unquote. He claimed Chaffin's thugs were murdering women and children around the town of Blair. White gathered a group of several hundred of the most militant miners and hijacked a train bound for the mountain town. After the battle, Mooney wrote he was convinced White was an agent provocateur who deliberately instilled anger into the generally peaceful march and the generally peaceful response by authorities. Upon hearing of White's hijacking, Chaffin called his men back to their posts in ready position to rain down fire. For many other miners, they believed Keeney's speech was another classic ruse. This way the Union could not be directly culpable for any crimes. Regardless of Keeney's true intentions, most armed miners remained around the camp just outside Logan. Passwords were shared. The miners' code was "I come creepin'," while Chaffin's men used a single word, "Amen." August 27th proved the most fateful day of the standoff and would truly begin the Battle of Blair Mountain. Chaffin inexplicably ordered Captain Brockes to detain Unionists who had disarmed police 2 weeks previously. Why in the world would he do this? Who can say? Perhaps Chaffin believed a show of force would end the standoff with relatively little damage to each side. Regardless, Brockes went into enemy territory with his squad. They arrested several unarmed miners and proceeded to use them as human shields when the same police squad confronted 5 armed miners. The standoff was broken by a deputy who shouted, quote, "We've come after you goddamn miners," unquote. As the firing died down, 3 of the miners used as human shields lay writhing on the ground, mortally wounded. The captain and his men frantically retreated, and in their haste 4 deputies became prisoners of an armed miner patrol. By the morning of August 28th, news of the harebrained excursion had spread, while also being embellished with more stories of savage oppression of women and children. The few hundreds of miners who had left since the vote rapidly returned to their camps. One group borrowed a Gatling gun and ammunition from a local company store. It was estimated the miners had de facto control of over 500 miles of West Virginia territory by the day's end. President Harding feebly proclaimed the miners must go home. His proclamations did not move the armed and angry men from their goals: free their comrades, kill Don Chaffin, and storm Logan. As the 2 sides waited for the general engagement, Bill Blizzard sent 2 scouting parties ahead in the darkness. One was led by Baptist minister John Wilburn. He said, quote, "The time has come for me to lay down my Bible and pick up my rifle and fight for my rights," unquote. Their patrol set out at dawn, and they inadvertently ran into John Gore and his patrol of deputy sheriffs. When they gave the wrong code word, "Amen," Wilburn and his squad decimated the 3 where they stood. Losing 1 mortally wounded in the close-range fight, they headed back down the mountain to report their findings. It was 90 degrees on August 31st when the full-scale battle first erupted on the slopes of Blair Mountain. The Unionists had to struggle uphill against multiple planned defensive positions, so the going was tough. In the north, the miners were launching their most successful assaults. Pinned by elevated machine gun fire, the miners attempted to turn the defenders' flank. Ed Reynolds was here with his squad's pilfered machine gun. They faced off against 300 deputies with 2 machine guns of their own. The miners under Reynolds managed to take the deputies' flank, but the deputies counterattacked with a force of 16 men, who fought ferociously for the hilltop. The deputies kept up their fire until a machine gun overheated and they were forced to pull back. Chaffin hastily deployed reserves to create a second defensive line along Crooked Creek Gap. That night, a car full of miners told Mooney they were going up Blair Mountain and taking Logan, and there was nothing the Union, Don Chaffin, or the President of the United States could do that would stop it. One of the miners said, quote, "The best thing you can do is to clear out and stay out until we get through," unquote. Mooney and Keeney had clearly lost control of the situation. the genie would not go back in its lamp. Their own actions had caused the demise of unions in West Virginia. Today, West Virginia is a right-to-work state, and union members make up only 4% of the state's population, much less than half the national average. Back in 1921, Keeney and Mooney were both indicted for crimes, and both decided to leave the state, abandoning their wives, children, and in-laws. On Labor Day, new assaults were made up Blair Mountain, but as the miners pushed closer to enemy positions, the harder the fight became. Machine gun fire absolutely devastated the miners' ranks. As if to make matters worse, the biplanes, which were originally used by Chaffin for air reconnaissance, were now dropping homemade explosives on the miners from the sky. This was the second time American authorities used aerial bombardment against its own citizens. The first was in 1921 against the black civilians in Tulsa, Oklahoma. American authorities would not aerially bomb civilians again until 1985, when helicopters set ablaze a black neighborhood in Philadelphia with incendiary explosives. Fortunately for the miners, Chaffin's pilots were poor shots, and none of their bombs hit home or injured any miner. In spite of the miners' lack of offensive staying power, Chaffin was growing increasingly nervous about his position. General Bandholtz seemed to be in a similar boat. He telegraphed Washington about the need for federal troops, quote, without delay, unquote. Goaded by his dispatched general, Harding finally authorized the deployment of 2,100 federal troops to southern West Virginia. The news of federal troops arriving caused cheering to erupt all along the fighting line. As the miners knew federal troops meant an end to the fighting, they would not seriously think of fighting Uncle Sam's men. To negotiate an end to the fighting once and for all, the head of the insurgent army, Bill Blizzard, met with an army captain. The captain informed Blizzard that those with permits could keep their firearms, otherwise they would be confiscated. But no harm would befall the miners in an extrajudicial manner. The next day, September 4th, 1921, miners came out in droves from the hills. Many were unarmed. Blizzard turned to the captain and wryly said, quote, when we need 'em again, we'll know where to look for 'em, unquote. The overall death toll from the battle cannot be known, but there were plenty of guesses. At first, newspapers reported 30 to 50 miners killed and another 50 to 100 wounded. I've also seen the unverified number of 100 to 300 miners killed. These men were veterans, so they understood their terrain, and they used it extensively for cover. Regardless of the casualties suffered, the fallout from the battle would be swift. Approximately 900 miners would be arrested. Keeney and Mooney would turn themselves in. The prosecution of the miners and leaders hinged on proof of treason, which was incredibly hard to pin on someone in West Virginia at the time. The end result was that Keeney, Mooney, Blizzard, and countless miners were acquitted. The few who served time usually served short sentences.